Alrighty lads, we are back. So, you want to know orcs and goblins during the War for Vengeance. Well, during the course of this video, you're going to learn these topics. These 5 specific subjects we're going to cover. First, we're going to cover where the vast majority of Greenskins are residing during this time period. Secondly, we're going to cover what historically has happened to the Greenskins so far, what led to them being in this territory. Thirdly, we will discuss how the elves and dwarves deal with Greenskins. Fourthly, we will discuss how the War of Vengeance affected the Greenskins. And then lastly, we will cover how this all accumulated and started the infamous Goblin Wars. I hope you guys enjoy. The video should be divided in segments, but before we really get started, I just want you guys to know I'm very appreciative that I get to start a YouTube channel where I talk about interesting minutia topics like this, where I read these books that are really awesome, you guys should definitely read, and I pick out these tiny little details and I accumulate them into one nice little video essay for you guys to listen to. As always, these are my interpretations. If you guys do not like some of these interpretations, you guys can always tell me down below, and then we can always talk about it. Why is it that I'm wrong? Why is it that your interpretation's better than mine? Again, I always enjoy this, so let's start the video with topic number 1. Where were the Greenskins residing during this time period? During the War of Vengeance, they resided in the east, far from the Badlands and mountain holds, deep within the Darklands, where the likes of ogres and the Dowizar reside. It is rumored that the desolate wasteland could only be survived by the hardiest of tribes. As of today, the land is predominantly populated by black orcs and hobgoblins, which are the hardiest of both species. Black orcs being the hardiest of orcs, and hobgoblins being the hardiest of goblins. But during the War of Vengeance, there was yet to be a variety of Greenskins. As of this time period, it was just orcs and goblins. There was no splitting yet into the multiple minor factions. We do see some savages of orcs, and we do see some wolf riders, but nothing as of yet like the spider goblins, or the night goblins, or the black orcs, or even the less mentioned iron orcs. But when it comes to the savages and the wolf riders, these were more of just orcs and goblins who have found ways of living, not exactly a separate species as of yet. Despite that, many goblin tribes still resided within the Kharazane core. For those of you who do not know, the Kharazane core is the name of the entire dwarf empire, more or less. To make it a very simple video, that's what you should know it as. Many wolf rider packs would usually prowl the streets and the roads, preying upon dwarves that were unsuspecting. But these were truly a minor threat, as it would take easily 3 wolf riders just to bring down a single dwarf during the War of Vengeance, even before the War of Vengeance. So when it comes to these wolf riders, we knew that they were very, very little of a threat. The other places in the world that was known to have harbored Greenskins at this time was Cathay. But during this time period, Cathay was also ruled by dragons, where dragonkind, both the Cathayan dragons and the normal dragons, would use the area more or less kind of like a cemetery, so they would easily push out the Greenskins if they were bothering their grave grounds. Lastly, we have the Mountain of Morn, which is right next to Cathay. This is the home of the ogres. Here we see that Greenskins definitely existed there at some point in time, but this is a weird time period, as technically this is after the ogres just got done getting wiped out by Cathay. So they were driven to the Sky Titans, and they were wiping out the Sky Titans in return and regrowing their numbers. So more likely what probably happened is that the goblin tribes who tried to migrate through are now being subjugated and slowly turned into the modern day goblin species known as the Gnoblars. So now that leads us to our second topic. What historically has happened to the Greenskins so far? Well, at this point, the Greenskins are battered, bruised, defeated at every turn. When they existed in the far, far south and in parts of Lustria, the lizardmen easily quelled the savage orcs and the primitive goblin menace, easily eating them and massacring them to pieces. Later, the orcs and goblins migrated into the Badlands, but the Badlands weren't the Badlands as we know them today. It was actually more considered Araby, and this is where we knew Nehekara had risen. Well, the Nehekarans, with their chariots, they were essentially just primitive humans using horses, spears, early mortuary cult magics, and that's all it took for them to drive out the orcs again. Now, this is during the time of Cetra the Imperishable, who was a man, but more or less a superhuman man. So even then, the orcs and the goblins stood no chance. Now, that we just talked about the Nehekarans down in Araby pushing the orcs and greenskins out of their territory, where would they migrate next? Well, the Badlands, also the World End Mountains, which is the home of the dwarves. So now we have the dwarves. This is where the dwarves had a much interesting history with the orcs. The dwarves took a lot longer and had a much harder time pushing the greenskins out. And this is what makes them so unique, as the Nehekarans and the lizardmen reacted fast to the threat. And using their fast units like raptors, dinosaurs, horses, chariots, they quelled the greenskins effectively, efficiently. But the dwarves, they're anything but fast. They're strong, they're hardy, they're tough. And we see that the dwarves having a sour attitude when dealing with other races is most likely influenced by their long history of dealings with the greenskins. For those who may not know, greenskins are diplomatically brutes. They lie, they cheat, they steal, they maim, and this is all for the sole purpose of destruction of anyone who isn't a greenskin like themselves. And most of the dwarves' dealings with the elves, we can see that they're paranoid, untrusting. Now, this is also in spite of the contrary. There's no reason the dwarves should be hostile and suspecting of the elves at this point in time. But this is kind of what you would expect to see from a race that has dealt with nothing but thieves and bullies for years upon years, is that they start to generalize and start to treat everyone as thieves and bullies, no matter the evidence to the contrary. Something interesting to note too is that the orcs and goblins started picking up iron weaponry from the dwarves during this time period. This is interesting, but we have to remember that after all, the more contact the greenskins have with a culture, the more they start to learn and assimilate from that culture. We see this with hobgoblins, where they specialize in wolf riding, as their main enemies at the time were Kurgans and other Norskins that were specialized in horseback riding. So, with the regular orcs and goblin tribes, they started to learn how to make iron weaponry. This is definitely a game changer. But alas, despite these innovations, they were still beaten back and bruised by the dwarves. Something the High King at this time admits to is that he fought dirty. Now, as to what that means by fighting dirty can be anyone's guess. My guess is that he probably bribed the other tribes to fight each other, but instead of paying them like he promised, he just killed them. There's also a possibility that he spawn camped the greenies. He found out where they were more or less being created, and he just started killing them from there, and effectively attritioned the greenskin tribes to death, wiping them out very thoroughly. So, now being beaten, bruised, they are now shattered into the Darklands. But what happened from there? Well, unfortunately for the Greenskins, the Dowizar, the sorcerers, the Chaos Dwarves, had just arisen and claimed themselves as a new empire separate from the dwarves. And here the free laborers of the West came flocking in for free, easy enslavement. The orcs and goblins would be subjugated and or chained and forced to work till they died. Aside from this terrible fate of slavery, the remaining Greenskins had to fight the ogres, the Norskins, and on occasion, a random demon, just to live and find food in these very harsh, bleak lands. It sounds grim, and truly it's a miracle that the Greenskins weren't wiped out by this point, but there is a small detail we are neglecting here. Many of the goblins were still inside the mountains. They just lived deeper than the dwarves could access. Many of the goblins could find nourishment off of the fungal shrooms that their spores produced. Many of the goblins could find adversity with each other and the Skaven race that dwelled even further down below. These boys would turn into the future of night goblins, having spent hundreds of years in the dark and nourishing on just a meager sustenance at best of shrooms, living under the sprawling might of the dwarves and fighting with the equally starving Skaven. They would slowly mutate into this new species, this new genre of goblin kind. So, the long discussion is over. Let's talk about the two primary factions, the elves and dwarves. How did they deal with the Greenskins? The dwarves, having the most contacts with the Greenskins, have treated the Greenskins harshly, punishing and or killing any that they could find, with impunity. The dwarves' cruelty towards the Greenskins was not entirely unfounded, as even when a goblin begs for mercy, he is only begging for mercy while he's holding a knife behind his back, ready to stab you. The dwarves are more than aware of this, and are very cautious when they are around any sort of greenskin kind. The dwarves usually capture goblins for games, like throwing axes or an arena fight, where they count their kills and place bets on who can kill the most. The elves, on the other hand, had not really dealt with such a race before, so in their view, they pitied the Greenskins. Pitied them as a terrible, weak race, not knowing that pitying the Greenskins is what the Greenskins want you to do. They will thrive on your pity. There was an interesting point in the War of Vengeance where a tournament was hosted to ease tensions between the two races, the elves and the dwarves. Well, what happened in this little tournament is that one elf and one dwarf would go into the arena, and they would fight together to see who can kill the most goblins. Well, near the end of one of the duels, an elf wounded a goblin and was deciding to leave this wounded goblin alone, sparing the pitiful creature, this mewling morsel begging for his life, with his flappy ears and his big nose. So the high elf, he looked down upon it and said, "What a pitiful life. I couldn't bring myself to kill such a weakling creature." But as he turned around, he saw that the dwarf that he was fighting next to chucked an axe at the elf, causing the elf to spin around and dodge the axe. But as he dodges the axe flew right into the goblin's head. The same goblin that the elf spared. The same goblin who was about to stab this elf in the back. To which the dwarf chastised the elf for being naive and to have his back on such a dangerous foe as the goblins. Something that, again, this elf had no idea how dangerous these vile creatures truly are. It's actually kind of interesting. I'm kind of talking off script here, but during this point, the elf was actually pissed at the dwarf for throwing an axe at him, not upset about the greenskin trying to stab him in the back, even though he saw and knew that that goblin was going to stab him in the back. This is the kind of thing that the High Elves did. They pitied too much of the Greenskins. So all in all, how did the High Elves as a species deal with the Greenskins? Well, they figured that they could command the Greenskins into obedience and easily wipe them with force. But unlike the dwarves, The elves would always turn their backs on the greenskin menace, never realizing the danger of letting a greenskin get behind them, even when they are saved time and time again by a dwarf chucking an axe to save their ass. This isn't me bashing the high elves, mind you. This is actually verbatim what happened in the books. And it's something that I find very, very interesting, as we see the two mindsets behind how you deal with the greenskins. The high elves see a race that's so weak and pitiful and so stupid that they view it with contempt. They more or less despise it. But they wouldn't bring themselves to actually end its species, because they don't view life that way. They don't view it as a good thing to have to wipe out a species and genocide it. The dwarves, on the other hand, see the matter very clear. They're like, the world would be so much better without these damn things roaming around the countryside. Very interesting, but we're kind of getting away from the main topic, so let's talk about it. The final thing. How did the War of Vengeance affect the Greenskins? This is where we tie everything together. How did all this beating, all this strife, all this chaos affect the Greenskins as a race? This is where things get really sexy. So you see, the orcs and goblins are nearly completely absent from the world. But we do hear about how the dwarves and elves have essentially fled from the world. The dwarves are migrating back into their holds, into their mountains, no longer having forts and cities out in the open. The elves are migrating back to their island home, avoiding the world as a whole. This left a massive power vacuum where the orcs and goblins could wander and find new trees and openings to live in that were once abandoned battlefields or abandoned cities. These areas, while the greenskins never stuck around, they definitely grabbed all that they could muster and fled back before being stomped out by any elven or dwarven patrols or armies. We also see that the dwarves have completely neglected their underway system. As their battles took place on the surface, this allowed things like Skaven and goblins to develop new trenches and avenues into the dwarf holds that tapped into their water sources, their food, even their arms and armor. There were some mentions of how certain weapons and armor started disappearing. This is interesting. Of course, the other dwarves blamed each other, just viewing it as like, oh, that other dwarf tribe must have stolen it from us, or, oh, that dwarf lackey who's our bookkeeper is just incompetent. There was no such thing as an axe being right there. That's what the dwarves attributed it to. Little did they realize the real significance of what this all meant. Now, at the same time, the chaos reigning on the world, there is some hints that the orcs and goblin tribes survived by killing the occasional demons. But the largest way of survival was primarily cannibalism. Orcs frequently engaged in eating their goblin kin, and thankfully for the orcs at this time, goblins were in massive supply. The new species of goblins, the night goblins, were the largest tribal power, and were gaining more and more ground underneath the dwarves' holds as the days passed. Here we can surmise that they leaked out minerals and other construction goodies to the scattered Badland tribes and to the scattered Darkland tribes that still existed. But, again, the resources were limited as best. But, thankfully, the night goblins would also cultivate their shrooms and possibly even sell their shrooms for power or sustenance to these wayward tribes. Here's where the recipe of disaster flourishes even worse. Now, only were people neglecting the greenskin menace, but the greenskins had found a way to thrive under the holds and cities of the dwarves, and thriving in the harshest wasteland of the world. Between ogres, chaos dwarves, and demons, the orcs and goblins kept growing in strength. And thanks to their night goblin kin, they were able to fashion crude iron weapons and armor, much like the dwarves. Those inventions that, mind you, are not nearly as fine made as the dwarves, but it still remains that the orcs had learned this in the past from being around the dwarves for so long. With the War of Vengeance coming to a close, the dwarves depleted, their Karaks now hating one another over pride and bickering over the High King position, losing their greatest runesmiths who could cast and forge mighty armors that could withstand a giant's punch, hiding and neglecting engineer patents due to their explosive failures against the elves, not realizing that demons had sabotaged those inventions. And now you have this recipe for disaster. While the dwarves declined and waned, the orcs had thrived. So that leads us to the end, how the infamous Goblin Wars started. Well, as all green tides go, they come as swift as a hurricane and dissipate as fast as they came. But this was not an ordinary hurricane. This was a lingering storm. The storm whose eye was forever hidden, whose length lasted over decades. The dwarves, having depleted and now isolated their kingdoms from the Karazhan core over petty squabbles and disputes, had made themselves more vulnerable than they could ever imagine. A massive earthquake occurred. Now this earthquake, some attributed it to the Skaven, who nearly blew up their home city of Skavenblight. Others attribute it to Nagash's ritual to turn all living creatures into undead thralls. Others attribute it to the Slan mages of Lustria adjusting the world according to their great plan. The more skeptical-minded just attributed it to natural tectonic plate movements. Nonetheless, no matter who's right, or maybe a combination of these theories, these earthquakes happened, and they broke the Underway. They shattered many passages the dwarves needed to conduct rapid transportation from one hold to another. The earthquakes left devastating holes in city walls. The earthquakes were so bad that many dwarves lost leaders and figures that were slain by accidents. Worst yet, some of the runic gates that were forever in place and forever irreplaceable broke. Runes that could withstand a nuke were now laying open and broken. Runes that no one could ever replicate because the smiths who made them had died from the wars. No one knew how to fix this problem. Something else too is that all the runic armories and weaponries, some of those weapons fell down into those cracks and are forever lost in history. To this day, dwarven expeditions scour into Skaven territory just looking to see if they could find these weapons that had fallen or these armors, because possibly there is a rune out there that's so powerful it could save the dwarves of modern day. These are those earthquakes that destroyed their once noble and glorious empire. These new pathways and new weaknesses that the dwarves suffered presented an easy opportunity for the vengeful Greenskins. Some debate there is about which of the holds fell first and whether the masterminds were the Skaven or the goblins, but I, dear listeners, shall tell you, it was both. Skaven and goblins working together devised many schemes to get rid of the holds of the dwarves, from floods to starvations to outright swarms. The dwarves were being wiped out easily and systematically. Whether this was a work of cooperation or just simply both of them enacting their plans together, I'm pretty 50-50 on that. I would assume it was probably more like that, where the Skaven and the goblins both schemed to kill the dwarves by flooding and polluting their food, and then they just so happen to be doing it at the same time with each other. And then we're like, oh look, new guys are in town, let's go kick their asses, because we drove out the dwarves, not realizing that they both drove out the dwarves. But the new night goblins must have told their cousins in the Badlands and in the Darklands about the developing situation. As the same time that the night goblins and the Skaven are conducting their assaults, the massive amounts of tribes started migrating across the mountains and came back into the Badlands in force. Massive orc and goblin tribes, easily a sea of fungal glory, came screaming their most terrible of sounds. Wog. Being attacked from above and below with no allies to call upon, many of the mountains and entire Karak holds fell with relative ease. The culmination of arrogance and pride doomed the dwarves, as they now realized that what they had done in the past all accumulated and led up to this pinnacle event. Had they not waged war and still had their legendary runesmiths, maybe this never would have happened. Had they still been united on the surface with their cities and their forts dotting the landscape, between the holds and the mountains, they may have had enough unity to push back this tide. Had they let their hot-headedness cool for a moment, they might have had an ally amongst the elves to call for aid. Had they not neglected their abandoned cities and their abandoned battlefields, they might have noticed the Greenskins were assembling arms and armor. In the end, the decline of the dwarves and the prospering of the Greenskins was directly caused by the dwarves' own actions. In the end, the Greenskins proved that in order to wipe them out, one must be swift in their response. Something that the dwarves learned well as their current future battle tactics now display a swiftness that the dwarves of ancient days did not exhibit. But that, my lads, is a tale and a story for another time. Let me know if you wish to see, quote-unquote, how dwarves fights Greenskins in the future, down below. But besides that, this has been me. See you lads next time. Always subscribe and spread the word, baby.